Now, this film is a really inspiring story about who is probably the grandest whistleblower of all time, arguably.
Probably, really. I mean, he has been called, the king of the leakers. He doesn't like that too much. The king of the whistleblowers. He's had all kinds of attention, and it's interesting how often people. There's a whistleblower in Israel right now. Her name's Anat Kam. They call her the Ellsberg of Israel.
Yeah, it's a great portrait of whistleblowing in general in that way, isn't it, this film? I mean, it's a bizarre thing how we sort of tend to react negatively often to whistleblowing, and I mean, he's reacted to so strongly negatively by so many people where you would logically think that the information that he's sitting on, anybody would surely see it as his duty to get it out there, but of course that's not quite how everybody...
No, because thousands of other people have the same information and they're sitting on it.
Yeah.
And why should you be the schmuck who is the one who, lets it out and takes the punishment for it? So I think that herd mentality is extremely strong.
I thought that he's a little bit hurt by a lot of the reaction of the people who actually sort of turned against him, though.
Oh, yes. Oh, in fact, 3 months ago, he was down at Stanford University, which is not, an hour from where we are, and he walked into Harry Rowan's office, who's now a fellow at the Hoover Institute, a sort of conservative think tank there, and he brought his book into him. He hadn't seen him since that time, I don't think, and said, "Harry, I just, wanted to come drop by and bring you my book, and I thought you might be interested," and he said, "Get out of my office."
Wow.
Would not speak to him. Dan was really hurt. He just didn't expect that.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, isn't it? I mean, how did you end up being the filmmaker who, gets to tell it?
Well, it took 4 years to make. I met Ellsberg about 2000 when I was working on my previous film, which was about World War II conscientious objectors. And a friend said, if you're working on a film on World War II, you really have to talk to Dan Ellsberg. He knows more about World War II than anyone. So I took him out to breakfast, and he talked through breakfast, through lunch, and until 3 in the afternoon. And I filled 2 legal pads with notes on World War II. And I thought, oh, this guy is amazing. I mean, of course, I knew who he was, and I was had been awed by what he'd done at the time. But just really sitting down with him and realizing what his mind was like, I was so inspired to, try and work on that film. But I couldn't at that. I was in the midst of finishing the other film, so I didn't get back to it for several years. And when I did, he had just come out with his autobiography, which is called Secrets. And that was actually perfect timing because he hadn't wanted anyone to do a documentary until he wrote his story. So he finally gets the story out. I came along and then enlisted Rick Goldsmith to work with me. And then there were 3 other filmmakers interested. It took us 6 months to convince him that we were the right team. When one of them was Errol Morris. So finally, Morris decided he was going to make his first drama about Dan, but I don't know if anything ever came of that.
Is that there from Fog of War?
Yes, yeah. Exactly. And right. I assume also that he probably felt that the subject was too close to Fog of War. It would have been sort of odd to make another film about, the same group of people.
I mean, in the end, what I loved was that you actually have him narrate his own story, which yes. I thought was sort of wonderful in that way, not to have that detachment that you get in that sort of narration. I mean, in a way you're taking a risk, though, aren't you? Because you're sort of opening it up for some detractors to sort of go, well, it's all sort of so subjective.
Exactly, and that was an argument till the very end between my partner and I. He was more journalistically inclined and thought it should be a voice of God voiceover and to be more objective and not to be criticized as, it all being Dan's story. And I felt like it made it much more personal and more of a narrative and more, that we could really look at the spiritual transformation and things in a way that would feel more genuine.
Oh, yeah, look, screw objective, I say. I think you end up with a story that works on such a personal, sort of psychological, spiritual level, which I think you wouldn't have had otherwise. I mean,
I think so.
Other docos don't really leave me feeling like that, I must say.
Good. Well, I think, it's, thanks to the incredible elements of the story, it really, we hope it really reads like a political thriller and like a love story and not just a didactic political documentary. It has elements of a narrative story that I think we tease out. Although I've been more and more interested to, not that I'm not a feature maker, but I kind of hope that it spawns a feature. I think it would be a great feature too. It's such a great story.
It's a wonderful story, isn't it? I mean, it really does have everything. I should tell our listeners there in that way. It's sort of got this beautiful love story
Yeah.
in it, and the twists and turns, especially if you don't know the whole story, which probably most of our listeners don't.
No, no one
It's edge of the seat stuff. So I mean, it's very different. It does run like a narrative much more than other sort of docos do. That sort of
and there's so
episodically
many
looking.
heroes in it. That's what I like. It's like the New York Times and all the other the 19 papers altogether who stand up to the government and hold their ground and really have this moment of courage and defending freedom of the press, which has never happened again and very unlikely to ever happen again. So there's that, lots of people get to be heroes in this story.
Yeah, it's actually a sort of a warm and fuzzy
Yeah,
documentary,
it is in
isn't
some
it?
funny way, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, leaking 7,000 pages of top secret. Your documents turns out to be warm and fuzzy.
Yes.
There's one. What is? I don't think that's in the film. Dan says at one point. There's something. 7,000 pages of top secret documents. It just has a bad ring to it. Someone saying about what he expected to happen. That was it. Has sort of a bad ring to it.
Yes, and sad too. I mean, especially look at the media. I mean, that really sort of stunned me as well. When you sort of, I mean, today we're sort of so used to sort of battling the media, where it's just all sort of, evil corporate speak jargon now. And I mean, to look at this good old days where the media actually played a role.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was just.
And the media at that point, even though we of course felt like it was terribly consolidated, and it didn't, but there were all these family-owned papers who really did stand for some principle and were willing to lose money because they had huge fortunes and had decided that newspapers were what they were going to invest their fortunes in. The Chandlers in Los Angeles at the LA Times. Those newspapers don't exist anymore. And they've all been consolidated. And there's nary a family-owned paper. And it's a very different world.
It's a beautiful portrait of the old school media in that way.
The New York Times won the Pulitzer for a story they sat on for a year, this wiretapping story that could have made the difference in Bush winning the second time. And they sat on it till after the election. And then they won the Pulitzer Prize for it.
Wow.
It's like, excuse me, that was bad journalism. And then you win the Pulitzer Prize?
Yeah.
For sitting on an really important story.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
Anyway, it's, things are bad and worse. Well, if you must see, I just saw in Tel Aviv at the Darc Festival there, Videocracy. Amazing film about Berlusconi and the stranglehold he has on the country and the media. Really worth seeing.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that thankfully hasn't changed, even though the rest of media may have, is Daniel Ellsberg himself, isn't he? I mean, I loved how at the end you show him sort of battling against the Iraq war now, isn't he? I mean, he's still going strong.
Yes. Well, he was on ABC the other day. I arranged for him to talk on the radio. He's done a lot of traveling with them. I've sort of worn him out, so he's trying not to travel too much right now. He's working on a book on nuclear war, which is really his passion.
The nuclear program was, in fact, the subject, am I right, of the other set of papers, because there were two sets.
Yes, he had two sets of papers. And one was on nuclear war. We weren't able to really tell the story because there isn't any documentation because the papers all flew away in a freak accident. He gave the papers to his brother Harry. He put them in a big old iron stove at a dump near his house. And there was a hurricane, and the iron stove was lifted up.
Oh, no.
Rolled down the hill, and all the papers skewed all over the hillside.
Goodness.
Dan said he actually rented a tractor thing, so with a scoop on them. He rented it to go down to see if he could actually find the papers, uncover the papers in the garbage. But most of them were lost forever. But he has such an amazing memory that he was able to actually reconstruct a lot of the information that was in them. And he's released some on the Internet in the last year.
Wow, so where do we go to find out his other juicy secrets?
Ellsberg.net is his website. Our website is mostdangerousman.org.
Well, I'm there. I mean, I think this is such a fascinating story, and I mean, a story that's fascinating in a way that has an outreach far beyond just the sort of lefty crowd that would usually run to see a political documentary. I mean, it's especially because it's the story of a man's sort of radicalization. He starts off, typically sort of right wing or very least planning the war, and then he sort of ends up so different. It's a story that surely has an outreach beyond just the sort of lefty crowd that would typically run in to see these sort of films.
Well, what's been really interesting? It's played incredibly well with military people. which I was not expecting.
Wow.
They've been eating it up. We had a 650-seat house in San Francisco, the Marines Memorial. The general who was dying to sponsor this film filled the house with mostly Marines, and asked for 100 copies to give to his friends inside the Pentagon.
Wow.
And the American Legion of Orange County has adopted this and showing it to all the Legionnaires. So that was an odd audience, and it played really well with young people, really well.